Last week we looked at some Agile practices in the first workshop. One practice was the use of test-driven development. Here we have the idea of writing code that repeatedly applies the steps red, green, refactor. Write a failing test, make the test pass, and if possible, improve the design. Another part of the workshop was to try pair programming. One of you was the driver and the other the navigator. This way of working certainly takes some getting used to. I think my main observation is that most pairs could swap more often than they did. Do this to keep both of you engaged in the task. And as I said last week, working in this way requires lots of communication, so continue to discuss what tests and code are being added as you work in pairs. You also tried to estimate how many stories you could develop successfully in about an hour of coding. We'll ask you a similar question in this week's workshop. We'll also come back to the topic of estimation and planning when we return to lectures in a few weeks. This week, you'll continue with some development for the bookstore application. There will be some extra stories to consider. Before you write any code, I want you to experiment with one technique that can be used to discuss the design for a system. This is CRC cards. CRC stands for Class, Responsibility, and Collaboration. This technique grew out of work to help teams discuss object-oriented designs. It's been used in some Agile teams to quickly discuss possible designs for part of a system. It's intended to be less formal than techniques such as UML, class, and sequence diagrams. The class is simply the class name. The responsibility is what the class is responsible for in the system. The collaboration is a way to identify other classes that this class works with. So for the bookstore that you are working on, you might have a class called Booklist, which is responsible for managing a list of books and searching for books. It could collaborate with the book class as part of that process. In this workshop, you will get to try this technique by discussing possible designs for the system, working in groups of about 6. The rest of this video is a reminder of some of the steps in TDD. You might like to look through it to refresh your memory of those steps. See you in the workshops. So the first thing we did was to create a Java project, and then we added in the JUnit library, just using the Eclipse interface, making sure that we were using JUnit 4. It's good practice to have some packages set up. So here we're just creating a source package for the source code and an extra package for the test code. So the first thing we need to do is to create ourselves a test case. It's easy when starting TDD to focus on wanting to create a class first, but we'll create a test case. So here we'll have a class called test booklist, which will hold our initial test cases. We click finish, and we get some stub code created by Eclipse, and we can just delete this original fail statement. We'll now take the test and change its name, so putting in a good description for the name. And we want to step through, so we want to create a list, and then our first test is going to be to make sure that it doesn't contain any books in it when it's first created. And then we will check that using a JUnit assert statement, so there should be 0 books in the list. In order to get it to compile, we need to add in a stub definition for booklist. So just a class there, and then also we need to have some definition for the method getNumberOfBooks. So we'll use Eclipse's technique to do that, and then we've got enough to be able to compile. So we run it as a JUnit test, and well, actually it passes, and we looked at this in the class. It's so simple that this first test passes. We haven't actually gone through a red stage. So the second test is going to look at the situation where we add a book into the list and then we confirm that the list has 1 book in it. So we have similar setup with book list, creating a new book list. We then want this idea of having a method that can add a book, and we pass in a book object. And then we check the number of items, number of books in this list, and this time the assert statement wants to check that there's one item in this list. So we now need to introduce the concept of a book to the system. We haven't written any code for that, so we'll use Eclipse to help us. We'll just make sure that's in the source package, not the test package. So we get this empty book definition, and then we need to add in this definition for add book. That goes into the book list class, and we'll just take an empty definition. It just needs to compile. Now we run the JUnits, and actually it should have failed. What we've forgotten to do is add @test, the annotation. So we run that test again now. It's picked up by JUnit, and there we see that there's a mismatch. As we'd expect, there's no functionality to do this. So we want a simple definition to be able to pass this test. And what we'll do is introduce a field, which will keep a simple count, and we'll return that value, and we'll also set it to 1 when a book's added. So we run the tests again, and this time we see that both tests pass. We're now going to add a third test. So this is going to take the idea one step further so that we can not only add one item, but we could put 2 books into this list and confirm that the list has these 2 items in there. So we take a very similar approach, but instead of just one add book method call, we have 2. And again, we get the number of items in the book list and check that that is equal to the expected value of 2. So we don't need to add any new functionality here. We can run the test. It actually fails. We should have this failing test. And now we need to think about how to solve it. Well, the obvious way is to fix the definition of add book. So we could do that with count equals count plus 1, count plus equals 1, or as I will use, count plus plus. And we run, and then the functionality passes. So we now have 3 tests, which tells us something about the class. And we have the situations of 0, 1, and 2 items in there. So let's change the internal definition and get rid of this internal field and replace it with an array list, and change the code so that it makes use of that array list. And then we can rerun the tests, and we see that they pass, and that confirms that we've made changes but not broken the functionality. Now let's take the situation where we've got a book and we now need to start adding functionality, such as adding a title. So we could start to add a test into test book class and go through the motions, create a book, set the title, retrieve the title, and assert that they're the same. So we've got this new test method, but the focus is wrong. The focus is wrong to be in this test class. We need to be able to create a new test class which is just going to focus in on tests to do with books, so test book. And then let's take that test method and move it into this new class. And then we've got a few things to fix, and we go through the steps of making sure we can at least compile the test, even though it's going to fail. So we add in constructor and a getTitle method. It introduces a new problem though, in so much as we need to decide what to do with the constructors that are used in test book list. Let's take a decision that they should all pass in a title. That's the easiest decision for now. So we can run those tests, and we see it fails. That's to be expected. And now we go in and do enough just to pass that test, so test title. So in closing, you've seen that we've been using long method names that are meant to be descriptive. That's intentional, and it's meant to help form part of documentation for the system. So as we look through a summary of the JUnit, we, from reading it, get some idea about what the system should be doing. So just to recap, This week's workshop is going to continue with these ideas of TDD and pair programming, but also we're going to be looking at this concept of CRC cards, one technique for being able to discuss design in a team. See you in the workshop.